Governor Padma Reyes Achebe answered the impossible call because there was nothing else left to do. 600 Ascendancy warships hung above Ossyrine Reach, black against the blue curve of the planet below. 3 billion civilians waited beneath them. The orbital ring was silent. The militia had powered down every weapon it owned, not because it had surrendered, but because everyone in the defense ministry understood the arithmetic. If Ossyrine fired first, Ossyrine died first. "They are repeating the surrender demand every 6 minutes," her defense minister said. His voice had gone calm in the way voices sometimes did, after fear had run out of places to hide. "Full annexation, dissolution of the planetary assembly, hostages from every major city. They are calling it a stability transition." Reyes Achebe looked past him to the old star chart on the wall. Most governors kept updated strategic maps in their crisis rooms. Ossyrine had one of those too, alive with fleet positions and casualty projections. But this older chart had been there since before her grandmother's grandmother was born, its edges worn smooth by hands long dead. At the border of known space, a pale line curved through the dark. The gray line. Every child on Ossyrine knew the story. Do not cross it. Nothing that crosses it comes back to explain why. Reyes Achebe had never believed the ghost story. She was too practical for ghosts, but the quarantine beacon was not a ghost. It was real. Faint, damaged by distance, but still detectable at the edge of Ossyrine's oldest sensors, more than 4 centuries after Earth went dark, repeating the same quarantine warning in every language the translation networks still recognized. Do not cross here. Highly contagious pathogen. Origin unknown. Containment not possible. Your safety is not guaranteed beyond this point. That was the loud signal, the one every ship knew to avoid. Buried beneath it, in Ossyrine's oldest emergency protocols, was the listening relay. Older, quieter, a channel from before the Ascendancy took tribute, before Ossyrine learned to call obedience peace, before the gray line became superstition. No living governor could prove it had ever worked. No living engineer could even explain why it had been preserved. Ossyrine had not always been an Ascendancy border world. Long before the Empire drew its maps over everyone else's, this system had sat along one of the minor trade routes Earth still kept, back when Earth had been an ordinary young member of galactic society, trading and traveling like anyone else. The relay code was never unique to Ossyrine. It was standard equipment, the unremarkable kind of thing any 2 trading neighbors exchanged, meant for nothing grander than flagging a ship in trouble. Some long-dead administrator had simply never deleted it once the trading stopped, and neither had anyone since. "Governor," her defense minister said, "we have hours at most before they stop asking and start taking. We need an answer." She did not have one. 3 billion people, and every road out of this room led to the same place. Kneel now or kneel after the bombardment. Then, on the oldest console in the room, the one nobody had ever powered down because nobody was entirely sure what it was for, a light came on. Incoming transmission. The room went very quiet. The channel it named was the listening relay. 4.5 centuries of silence, and it was ringing. "That is not possible," someone said, without conviction. Reyes Achebe crossed the room, and because there was nothing else left to do, answered. The voice was calm, unhurried, and speaking her language with an accent no living being had ever heard. "Governor Padma Reyes Achebe, we know your situation. We have watched that fleet since it left its staging ground. We will not act without your consent. That is not how we do things, and it is not how we will begin. So we are asking you plainly, do you want our help?" She looked at her defense minister, at the ceiling, beyond which 600 warships hung in her sky, at the small light that should not exist. "Yes," she said. Whoever you are. Yes. Then do not surrender the planet. Do not attempt mass evacuation. Keep your people sheltered. We are already closer than you think. There was no signature. There did not need to be. 461 years earlier, Earth went dark, and the civilizations responsible closed the file and moved on, satisfied. They were wrong about almost everything that mattered, but they were especially wrong about that. It started on the colonies, not on Earth. The newest, farthest human worlds were the first to fall, the ones with the least defense against anything that wanted to reach them quietly. It moved through a dozen of them in a single week, then rode the same supply ships that had always connected the colonies to the homeworld. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was everywhere. The genetic sequencing, when it finally came back from the lab, told the part of the story nobody wanted to hear. The pathogen was not natural. Its targeting was too precise, too perfectly calibrated to human biology alone. Somebody, somewhere among the galaxy's older powers, had looked at a young species learning to walk between stars and decided it would be easier not to have the conversation about what they might become. 11 billion people died in 11 weeks, not conquered, not defeated in any battle anyone could point to and grieve properly. Just gone, erased by something that never announced itself, never demanded surrender, never had the decency to be an enemy you could see coming. What remained of humanity did not weep for very long, not because the grief was not enormous enough to justify it, but because grief required someone still willing to guarantee there would be a tomorrow to grieve into, and nobody was offering that. So humanity made one for itself. They withdrew, not in defeat, but in the deliberate silence of a species that had just learned being seen too soon could be a death sentence. They pulled every remaining colony back past the edges of surveyed space, into the dark nobody had bothered to chart. They did not leave entirely empty-handed. Long before the plague, when Earth had still been an ordinary young member of galactic society, trading and traveling like anyone else, a standard emergency relay had been built into the systems shared with nearby partners. It was the unremarkable kind of thing neighbors exchanged, meant for nothing grander than flagging a ship in trouble, a channel that could carry a call in either direction, for whichever side needed the other first. It had carried nothing at all in longer than anyone could remember. Then came the withdrawal, and with it, one last thing humanity chose to add. They seeded the dying edge of human space with a quarantine beacon, layered beside the old listening relay, repeating without pause in every language the galaxy's translation networks recognized. It was not a threat, and it was not a plea. Do not cross here. Highly contagious pathogen. Origin unknown. Containment not possible. Your safety is not guaranteed beyond this point. They left it running because they were dying, and still could not bring themselves to let anyone else die beside them by accident. Even after humanity learned how to survive the engineered plague, they could not prove the danger was gone. They did not know whether dormant variants remained in abandoned stations, whether the pathogen might twist itself around other biology, or whether its makers had left traps waiting for whoever came looking. So the warning stayed. It had begun as mercy. Over centuries, it became camouflage. The galaxy heard only the warning, never the reason behind it, and within 2 generations decided it was easier to call the whole thing a myth than to keep being afraid of an empty patch of space. Nobody, in all that time, ever thought to check whether the older, quieter signal sitting beneath the warning was still listening too. Humanity healed. Humanity grew. Humanity watched. So completely silent that the beacon itself became the only public proof they had ever existed at all. A ghost story children were told to explain a line on a star chart nobody could remember drawing. Do not cross the gray line, the stories said. Nobody remembered it had ever been a kindness. They were about to be reminded. The Corvain Ascendancy had stood for 1,000 years. That was the first thing every subject child learned, before mathematics, before local history, before the names of their own elected officials, if their world still had any. 1,000 years of order, 1,000 years of border, 1,000 years of one truth repeated until repetition became law. The Ascendancy endured because nothing larger existed. Its current hierarch, Threxus Val, had held the throne for only 31 of those years. His empire was ancient, but his authority was not. The Val line itself was 451 years old, born from the Spoils War that followed humanity's disappearance, when factions inside the older Ascendancy and its allied powers fought over the territory, secrets, and guilt left behind. The faction that won did not create the Ascendancy. It captured its memory, rewrote its records, and taught the next 5 centuries to mistake silence for innocence. Threxus inherited all of it, the 1,000-year empire, the 4.5-century lie, and the private fear that everyone could tell the difference between power earned and power merely received. His throne room floated at the center of a dead star's collapsed core, held aloft by gravity engines older than most species' written history. They had not been built by the Ascendancy. They had been salvaged from whatever power had lived there before, then wrapped in enough ritual, maintenance, and armed secrecy that nobody had to admit the Empire was squatting inside another civilization's masterpiece. 9 subject races knelt in the outer rings when he entered. The Ascendancy controlled 11,000 systems. Its war fleets had ended 6 rebellions in the last century alone, each one crushed within weeks, each one broadcast as a lesson to every world still foolish enough to imagine resistance was possible. His name was Threxus Val, and today, for the first time in his reign, someone was about to push back. Archivist Elira Sen had spent 11 cycles cataloging dead languages nobody else cared about, which was precisely why nobody noticed when she found the wreck. It was not much. A derelict drifted at the edge of the Ascendancy's surveyed border, so old that its hull had fused partway into a passing asteroid over some unknowable span of centuries. Salvage crews had stripped it decades before Elira ever reached it, taking the metal and leaving the rest, the way you might take meat from a carcass and leave the bones for the ground to swallow. What they had left behind was a sealed archive core, dark and undamaged, humming faintly with a power source that had apparently never once needed replacing. It took her 4 months to crack the encryption. What came out the other side was not a language, not exactly. It was closer to a diary, written by something that called itself, in translation, as literal as she could manage, the Watchkeeper. This vessel served what would become the Terran Compact for 110 years, the log began. Its surviving crew were evacuated when the plague left them too ill to fly. We do not destroy what has served us. We do not destroy anything we do not have to. Elira sat with that line for a long time before she understood why it unsettled her more than any threat could have. The Terran Compact. Humans. Elira had grown up on stories about them the way children on 100 Ascendancy worlds grew up on stories about them. Half mockery, half warning, and mostly ignorance, polished smooth by time. The nursery version was simple. Do not cross the gray line. Nothing that crosses it comes back to say why. But older versions of the prohibition had survived in damaged footnotes, border sermons, and directorate training fragments too obscure for anyone important to censor. Those versions did not claim humans had been the strongest species in the galaxy. That was what made the fear stranger. By every familiar measure, humanity should have been manageable. They were not the oldest, not the fastest, not the most numerous. Their ships were crude by imperial standards, their colonies young, their biology fragile, their politics embarrassingly loud. But every time the galaxy measured them, The answer expired. Humans adapted too quickly. They took apart technologies they barely understood and returned them improved. A farmer became an engineer when the pump failed, and nobody thought to tell her that was not how it was supposed to work. The old powers had a word for species like that: unbounded. Not infinite, not divine, just impossible to forecast. A people whose limits refused to stay measured. To empires built on prediction, hierarchy, and control that made humanity more dangerous than any fleet. The service log was not all the Corps held. Before it went dark, the vessel had spent its final years as something closer to a record ship than a warship. Supply routes, colony registries, medical shipment logs, and 3 separate entries about a species called the Ovreth being given famine relief with no request for anything in return. It read less like a war record, and more like the patient bookkeeping of a civilization that had expected right up until the end to keep doing this for a very long time. Elira brought it to her director. Her director brought it to the regional prefect. The prefect, sensing an opportunity to be noticed by someone above him, brought it directly to the hierarch's court, and made sure everyone in the chamber knew whose discovery it had originally been, mostly so he could take credit for bringing it forward. Threxus Vale listened to the translated log for exactly 4 minutes before he started laughing. "A ghost story with a filing system," he said, and the outer rings of kneeling delegates laughed with him, because that was what you did when the hierarch laughed. "Archivist, you have found evidence that something built spreadsheets. Congratulations." "Hierarch," Elira said, and felt her own pulse hammering, because commoners did not correct the hierarch, and archivists especially did not. "The core inside that wreck is still active after what our instruments estimate as 4.5 centuries minimum. We have relics older than this, yes. Your throne itself rests on engines older than the Ascendancy. But those engines require a cathedral of technicians to keep them from tearing this palace apart. This was a sealed archive core inside a dead ship, unattended, stable, and still waiting to be read. Nobody in known space builds systems that patient by accident." The laughter thinned, but did not stop. Threxus leaned forward on his throne, 31 years of inherited authority sitting behind his eyes like a debt he had never chosen to owe. He was not a fool. That was the part history would later forget. A myth with working machinery behind it was not nothing, and Threxus knew it. But knowing a thing and being seen to fear it were not the same problem, and only one of them could get him killed by his own court. A border world named Ossyrine Reach had just filed for renewed independent status, ending 40 years of tribute payments the Ascendancy had never formally required, but had always quietly expected. If Threxus looked afraid of a ghost story in the same week a farming world challenged him, the Empire would smell weakness. The subject races kneeling in the outer rings would remember that even a 1,000-year empire was still made of people who could stand up. So caution had to wear the mask of arrogance. "Do you know what I think, Archivist?" he said. "I think the old prohibitions confused potential with prophecy. If any humans survived, then they are not gods. They were an unbounded border species with crude ships, short lives, and an irritating talent for turning every limitation into a ladder. That is what the old records claimed. Not that they were powerful. That they would not stay weak long enough for power to remain comfortable." He stood, letting the movement silence what remained of the laughter. "You will accompany the annexation fleet to Ossyrine Reach. You have shown this court a myth. I will show you what is real. Watch what happens to worlds that mistake old warnings for new protection, and return to tell me exactly what you saw." Elira lowered her eyes. "As you command, Hierarch." She did not know, as she left the throne room, whether she had failed to prevent a disaster or merely been ordered to witness one. Ossyrine Reach was, by any reasonable measure, an unremarkable world. 3 billion people, mostly farmers and fabricators, a modest orbital ring, and exactly no military to speak of beyond a planetary militia, armed with weapons 2 generations out of date. It had survived on the edge of Ascendancy space for 40 years by being useful, cooperative, and entirely unthreatening. Governor Padma Reyes Achebe had spent those 40 years, her entire adult life, trying to keep it that way. When the annexation fleet dropped out of transit above her homeworld, she had believed for one long gray morning that she had finally failed. Then a dead channel had rung. A voice from beyond the gray line had asked her for one word, and she had given it. Now its instructions sat on the crisis room's oldest console like something out of scripture. Do not surrender the planet. Do not attempt mass evacuation. Keep your people sheltered. We are already closer than you think. Reyes Achebe swallowed once, then sent 2 more words after her first. Holding position. For almost a minute, nobody in the crisis room moved. Then Reyes Achebe turned from the console, opened the planetary emergency net, and let her voice go everywhere at once. People of Ossyrine Reach, this is Governor Reyes Achebe. You will see ships above us. You will hear rumors before you hear facts. Here are the facts. Help has been offered. I have accepted it. Until I know more, I am asking you to remain calm, remain indoors where instructed, and do not give the Ascendancy the panic it came here to harvest. Her aide muted the channel after the broadcast and looked at her with wet eyes. Do you believe them? Reyes Achebe looked up through the reinforced ceiling, as if she could see the old line on the star chart through stone, atmosphere, and fear. I do not know, she said honestly, but I know the Ascendancy is waiting for us to stop believing in anything, so we will start there. Fleet Marshal Halden Ossi had commanded the Terran Compact's 4th Watch for 19 years, and in that time he had grown accustomed to a particular kind of silence. The silence of a species that had decided 461 years ago that the price of being seen too soon was higher than the price of watching unseen for as long as it took. He carried a name that had come down to him from a doctor who had worked an intake ward through the worst 11 weeks in human history and never once stopped counting who was still alive to save. Ossi had never met her. Every human alive today was, in some sense, descended from people who had done exactly what she had done, kept working, kept counting, kept refusing to let the number reach 0. He did not think about her often. He thought about her now, watching a fresh set of warships mass above a world that had done nothing to deserve them. 4.5 centuries was a long time to hold a promise, long enough that most of the people keeping it had been born, lived, and would die without the galaxy beyond the gray line ever learning they existed at all. Osei had grown up on the story the way every compact child did, not as legend, but as unbroken record, source-verified, never softened for the young. He knew what it had cost Earth. What he had learned later, in 19 years of patient watching, was the part the early history books had guessed at, but never been able to prove. The Corvain Ascendancy had not been born from humanity's killers. That would have been simpler. It had already existed, old and hungry, when the plague began. Its expansion directorate had helped organize the coalition that engineered the pathogen. When the plague did its work, and the coalition fractured over the spoils, the faction that won the internal war became the Val line. They inherited the Empire's throne, buried the records, and taught a 1,000-year ascendancy to forget the one crime it most needed to remember. Humanity had not forgotten. Humanity had simply decided that revenge was a poor architecture to build nearly 5 centuries of purpose on. Watching, instead, was something you could sustain. Fleet Marshal, said Lieutenant Priya Okafor Lindqvist from Communications. She had joined the 4th Watch straight out of the academy 8 months earlier, and the brightness in her face had nothing to do with excitement. It was the look of someone seeing, for the first time, that all the training had been real. Governor's answer is logged and relayed. She's holding position. No mass evacuation underway. Good, Osei said. All wings. Confirm station keeping. I want disabling solutions checked twice on every hull. Nothing lethal leaves this fleet today, unless I give the word. The tactical display held the Ascendancy fleet's full composition. 600 vessels the Fourth Watch had catalogued hull by hull during the long cloaked shadow from the staging ground, arranged in the kind of confident, wide-open formation that told Osei everything he needed to know about how little resistance this fleet had ever faced. 600, Okafor Lindqvist said. That's a real fleet, sir. That's not nothing. No, Osei agreed. It is not nothing. He studied the formation a moment longer. The wide spacing, the exposed command carriers, the aggressive power distribution, the weapons already hot above a civilian atmosphere. It is just not the difficult part. She looked at him. Osei kept his eyes on the display. The difficult part is making sure they all live long enough to learn from this. Threxus Vale stood on the observation deck of his flagship, the Undying Sovereign, watching Ossyrine Reach turn slowly beneath him, and told himself he felt satisfaction rather than the thing that actually lived underneath it. The low, familiar need to prove, again, that 31 years on a throne he had not earned was still enough. Archivist Elira Sen stood 3 paces behind him, and wished she had been left among dead languages. Governor Reyes Achebe has not responded to our surrender terms, the fleet commander reported. Orbital defenses remain passive. Should we begin bombardment of their capital as a persuasion measure, my hierarch? Threxus considered it, turning the decision over with more care than it deserved, because the ceremony of choosing whether to be generous was one of the few places left where his authority still felt entirely his own. Then he glanced at Elira. 1 hour, he said. Let it never be said the Ascendancy withheld mercy. I want every relay in the fleet recording. I want every court in the Ascendancy to see what becomes of worlds that mistake old ghost stories for new protection. He smiled. Then we begin. He did not notice at first the way the space around his own fleet had begun very quietly to change. It was his sensor officer who noticed, a contact where no contact had been, inside the fleet's own perimeter, with no approach vector, no transit signature, no history. Then another. Then a widening ring of them, blooming silently between his own ships, like lights coming on in a house he had believed empty. My hierarch, the sensor officer said. Something in his voice made Threxus turn from the window. We have contacts inside our formation. They did not arrive. They were already here. The fleet commander stepped closer to the display. How many ships? The officer's hands were not quite steady on his console. 30, now 60, now 90. They are decloaking everywhere. Across 600 ships, the Ascendancy fleet discovered the difference between reading about an impossible thing and being inside one. Collision alarms screamed on a dozen bridges as vessels appeared within spitting distance of hulls that had believed themselves alone. Point defense batteries spun up automatically, then froze, waiting on authorizations from captains who were still trying to understand what they were authorizing. 3 cruisers broke formation on pure instinct, scattering like startled animals, and nearly rammed each other doing it. The fleet's comm channels filled with overlapping voices, demanding orders, targets, explanations, anything. Elira Sen forgot, for one dangerous second, to lower her eyes. The darkness took off its mask. Fleet Marshal Osei watched the Ascendancy formation ripple with confusion as the Fourth Watch shed its cloaks around them. 140 ships that had been holding silent station inside the enemy's own formation since before Threxus Val ever gave his hour. "We are already closer than you think," had not been reassurance. It had been a plain statement of fact. He opened a channel, unencrypted, wide enough that every ship in both fleets would receive it. "Ascendancy Fleet, this is Fleet Marshal Halden Osei of the Terran Compact's Fourth Watch. You are currently threatening a civilian population that has accepted our protection. You will withdraw to a distance of no less than 1 light hour from Ossyrine Reach, and you will do so now." There was a long pause before Threxus Vile's voice returned. A pause filled, on 600 bridges, with officers dragging their ships back into line, and their crews back into silence. When he finally spoke, Osei could hear, beneath the practiced authority, the sound of a man recalculating everything he had believed that morning. "This is Hierarch Threxus Vale of the Corvain Ascendancy, Terran." His voice sharpened. "That is a dead species, a border myth." "No, Hierarch," Osei said. "We are not a myth, and we are not dead. The gray line was warning you not to mistake silence for absence. Withdraw your fleet. This is the only version of this conversation where nobody has to die." On the undying sovereign, Elira watched Threxus hear the offer, and failed to recognize it as one. His pride was not loud. That made it worse. It moved through him like old programming, like a palace built around a machine no one alive understood how to stop. "My Hierarch," the fleet commander said quietly, "they are inside our firing solutions. Every weapon we discharge at them risks our own hulls behind them. The positioning is not an accident." Of course it was not an accident. Even Elira, an archivist with no military training at all, could see the shape of it. The humans had not placed their ships where they could best destroy the fleet. They had placed them where the fleet could least afford to try. 140 ships, Threxus said, against 600. Whatever you are, Fleet Marshal, you have made a mathematical error. He lifted one hand. "All ships, engage." What happened next took 4 minutes, and every version of the story that spread afterwards across 100 systems would eventually shrink those 4 minutes down to a single sentence. The Ascendancy fired everything it had, and none of it mattered. The truth, as Threxus Vale experienced it, was worse than that sentence, because it happened slowly enough for him to watch every stage of his own certainty come apart. The first volley struck a shimmer of displaced space around the nearest human vessel and simply ceased to exist. Not deflected, not absorbed. Ended, the way a word stops meaning anything once you have said it too many times. What almost nobody on the Ascendancy side understood, until the recordings were studied later, was that a third of that volley, fired point-blank through their own formation, had been on course for Ascendancy hulls the moment it left the barrel. The human defenses swallowed that too. The first lives the Terran Compact saved that day belonged to the fleet that was shooting at them. On the Fourth Watch's flagship, a junior officer's hand hovered over a console that could have answered that volley with something far less merciful. Osei did not look at her. "Hold," he said quietly, the way a man says a word he has had to say before, and knows he will have to say again before the day is done. It was not an easy order to give to people raised on the memory of 11 billion dead. It was simply the order that had to be given. The second volley did the same. By the third, half his captains had stopped firing entirely, not from any order, but from the specific paralysis of soldiers who have just watched their entire understanding of what a weapon is stop applying to the world. "Return fire from the human fleet is minimal," the tactical officer reported, voice cracking. "They are not attacking our ships, my Hierarch. They are disabling them, selectively. Engines only, weapons only. No hull breaches, no casualties reported on any ship yet." "That is not possible," Threxus said, and heard distantly how much his own voice had begun to resemble every defeated enemy he had ever mocked for saying exactly that. Then one Ascendancy cruiser tried to prove him right. Its captain overloaded the main batteries, either from panic or obedience, or the terrible place where the two become indistinguishable. The ship's reactor spiked. Its engines died half a second later, and momentum carried the crippled vessel towards a neighboring carrier filled with 3,000 crew. For the first time, Ossyr's voice sharpened. "4th and 7th, catch that cruiser. Medical wing, stand by for reactor bleed. Nobody dies because one captain mistook obedience for loyalty." Two human ships moved, not towards victory, but towards rescue. Their fields caught the cruiser like hands closing around falling glass. A third vessel slid between the cruiser and the carrier. For 12 seconds, the tactical display became a storm of warnings, all of them civilian, medical, containment, evacuation. Then the reactor spike flattened. The cruiser lived. So did the carrier. On the undying Sovereign, Elira Sen watched human ships save an enemy fleet in the middle of defeating it, and understood the Archive Corps differently than she had before. We do not destroy anything we do not have to. It had not been sentiment. It had been doctrine. It took 4 minutes for 600 Ascendancy warships to go, one by one, dark and silent and utterly harmless, drifting above Ossyrine Reach like a fleet made of glass ornaments rather than weapons of conquest. Not one exploded. Not one crew member died. Threxus Val's flagship included. The silence that followed was worse, in its way, than any explosion could have been. Ossy did not gloat. Gloating had never once, in 4.5 centuries of careful doctrine, been found to accomplish anything the Compact actually wanted. He opened the channel again. "Hierarch Val, your fleet is disabled, not destroyed. Nobody aboard those ships is going to die today unless you make choices that force our hand. The withdrawal we asked of you will still happen, under escort, once your engines are returned to you. I want you, your captains, and every government that will receive this recording to understand why." He let the silence stretch. "We have recovered the old Directorate records, Hierarch. 461 years ago, a coalition of the era's dominant powers engineered a plague and released it into human space because they judged us a threat worth eliminating before we could grow into one. The Ascendancy was not young then. It had already been ruling for more than 5 centuries. Its expansion directorate helped build that coalition. When the coalition fractured, the faction that won your internal war became the Val line, buried the records, and inherited the throne." On the flagship, Threxus did not look at Elira. No one did. "The old Directorate feared what it could not predict," Ossy continued. "So it made a decision empires always call practical when they are too afraid to call it murder. You did not release that plague, Hierarch. Your people alive today did not release it. But the empire you inherited benefited from it, hid it, and built policy on the assumption that small species only matter after they become too dangerous to erase." A pause. "That includes your people. That includes the crews aboard your ships. That includes Ossyrine Reach." On Ossyrine, Governor Reyes Achebe stood in the crisis room as the tactical feeds translated impossible events into language her staff could bear to understand. Enemy disabled. Civilians alive. No bombardment. No impact. No confirmed deaths. A young aide began to cry openly. Nobody told him to stop. Above them, medical shuttles from the 4th Watch's support wing were already docking with the nearest disabled Ascendancy cruisers. Not to board them as conquerors. To check on crews who had just watched every certainty they had built their lives on come apart in 4 minutes. Ossy's voice crossed every open channel. "We are not here to end the Ascendancy. We are here to end this specific decision, on this specific day, about this specific world. What you do with the rest of your history is yours to decide. But Ossyrine Reach is not yours to take, Not today. Not ever, if they do not want it to be. For a long time, Threxus Vale said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, the inherited confidence of a 1,000-year empire had thinned into something Osei recognized immediately, not from old victories or private wars, but from every honest simulation, every historical surrender, every recording of an empire discovering the universe had been larger than its maps. "Why did you not destroy us?" Threxus asked at last. "After what you claim our empire did." "Because becoming the thing that hurt us was not a price worth paying," Osei said. "Especially not for justice." Elira saw Threxus close his eyes. For one moment, he looked less like a hierarch than a man standing at the edge of a history he could no longer command. "Take your fleet home," Osei said. "Tell your court what you saw here. Then think very carefully about what kind of ascendancy you want to leave behind when your reign ends, because the galaxy is about to start paying much closer attention to the answer." The Ascendancy's retreat took 11 hours to complete. 600 ships limping home under minimal power, escorted at a respectful distance by exactly enough of the Fourth Watch to make certain nobody changed their mind halfway. It was not, in the end, the retreat itself that changed the galaxy. It was what came after. The medical convoys that arrived at Ossyrine Reach within the week, quietly restocking a hospital system, strained by 40 years of scraping by on the margins of Ascendancy trade routes. The agricultural engineers, who spent a season helping 3 farming collectives adapt to a blight nobody outside the system had ever bothered to study. The modest, unglamorous, entirely unbilled repair crews who fixed an aging water reclamation plant that had been failing for a decade because nobody with the resources to fix it had ever had a reason to care. None of it was announced with fanfare. None of it needed to be. Governor Reyes Achebe watched it happen and understood, slowly, that she was witnessing something rarer than the battle had been. A power large enough to take anything it wanted, choosing instead, patiently and repeatedly, to give. And that, more than the battle, was what frightened the Ascendancy. The old prohibition had been right in the one-way propaganda sometimes is. Humanity did spread, not through blood, not through conquest. Through repaired hospitals, clean water, honest treaties, and the unbearable example of power that did not need to kneel on anyone to prove it was real. Word of Ossyrine Reach spread the way stories always spread fastest, through the people who governed nothing and controlled nothing, and simply talked to each other across 1,000 systems the Ascendancy had never fully managed to silence. Within a year, 41 independent worlds along the old Gray Line had petitioned to establish standing communication with the Terran Compact. Within 3, the Ascendancy itself, not defeated, not conquered, but visibly and undeniably no longer the largest number in the room, sat across a negotiating table from a species the Veil Order had spent 4.5 centuries reducing to a warning mark on a map, working out the terms of a border it would from then on actually respect. Threxus Vale did not attend that negotiation. In the year following Ossyrine Reach, he quietly ceded most of his authority to a council of regional governors who had grown tired of an ascendancy whose reputation for invincibility had turned out to have a very specific, very findable edge. He spent the years that followed, according to the few reports that ever reached the Compact, mostly in private study of the Terran Compact's public historical archive. It was the same archive, as it happened, that archivist Elira Sen spent the rest of her career helping catalog, translate, and teach. 10 years after Ossyrine Reach, Elira Sen stood in front of a lecture hall on a world that had, within her own lifetime, gone from Forbidden Zone ghost story to formal treaty partner, and found herself, for once, without a prepared opening. A student near the front raised a hand. He was Ascendancy born, young enough that the Gray Line had never meant anything more sinister to him than a border on a map. "Professor Sen," he asked, "when you found that wreck, did you know it would lead to all this?" Elira considered the question the way she had learned, over a long career, to consider all the good ones, slowly and without pretending to certainty she did not have. "No," she said. "I thought I had found a filing system. I did not understand, not really, what it meant that something could keep a promise for 4.5 centuries, without once needing anyone to notice it was doing so." She still thought some days of the 12 seconds she had spent watching 2 human ships catch a dying Ascendancy cruiser out of the dark rather than let it fall. Nobody had ordered them to explain that choice. They had simply made it, the way people do when mercy has stopped being performance and become discipline. She glanced towards the window, where the light of a dead star's core still glowed faintly through the old palace crystal, years after the throne it once lit had stopped mattering to anyone. "I understand it a little better now. It is not the size of the fleet that changes a galaxy. It is the size of the patience behind it." The student wrote that down. Elira let the silence sit a moment before she went on, because some lessons she had learned were worth letting settle before you moved past them.